Welcome to the Embodied Life podcast with Jake Potter. The Embodied Life podcast is brought to you by the Australian Centre for Embodied Practice, bringing the wisdom of the world's embodied and somatic practices together, intersecting deep thinking and embodied learning to restore goodness to ourselves and the world. I'd love to wind back to, your beginning sort of moments in time. And, I was reading some of the stuff that you'd written, and you spoke about, when you were a child, that your family was your first international team. And so you kind of grew up in this world of diverse beliefs, diverse ideas, differing kind of altering ways of being in the world from your, initial family, which you describe as your international team, which I just thought was such a lovely little phrase. So I'm wondering if we can just start there, how sort of your childhood led you to where you are now and being really established in, who you are.
Oh, thank you for that lovely question, because I think this was like an illuminating moment. I had this realization that my family was my first international team after working for years and years with international teams. And I think it was one evening after, I think it was a team building, and there were half the group were from China, half the group were from Germany, and my job was to spend 3 days with them, building bridges so they kind of understand each other better and have trust and whatever. And in the morning, I think I'd said, oh yeah, my first international team building was at Microsoft. I worked with Microsoft for a long time. And then I was sitting at the bar that evening, I thought, it's not true. It wasn't Microsoft, it was actually my family. And that was probably the most challenging international team. Not that my family was more difficult than anybody else's family, but it was really confusing for me as a child to be the product of two very different cultural groups. Yeah, so my mother's family was very British from the north of England, very down to earth. My granddad took me out rabbit hunting. He bought me a shotgun when I was 8 years old, and he said, "Get on with it, love, and be tough, and that kind of don't cry and stiff upper lip." And I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. So that was the English side. And the following weekend, I'd go to my other side of the family. They were Russian Jewish immigrants, originally from Odessa, which is now Ukraine. Back then it was Russia. And my grandmother, it was like going to a different planet. She was very sensitive, incredibly volatile, emotional. She read a lot of poetry. She introduced me to Omar Khayyam, and she read Russian poems to me, played classical music, cooked fantastically. The British usually don't. She'd say to me, "Nina, you can always tell how civilized a culture is by the food they cook and eat." And she'd whisper, "The British are barbarians." And I think, "Oh, are they? Am I? Am I half a barbarian? Where do I belong? Where do I want to belong to? Who am I? On the other hand, I'd get very emotional at home, and my mom would say, "Stop being so Jewish," and I think, oh, that's not allowed to be emotional. So I had this big question mark very early on in my life. And part of the culture, I think it's often in immigrant families, it's kind of hidden. The Jewish side, for example, or we don't talk about that. And I think that the future generations, if something is suppressed, they really want to know about it because it's a need. I think our ancestors in some way cry out to be heard and to be acknowledged. So there I was, like being very confused. Then I went to live in the States, and then I came to Germany. I'm in Germany right now. And I went through the most awful culture shock. I was pregnant with my first child. And I turned what I would say was a crisis of identity and culture shock into my career. So I was kind of lucky. I think that we all have the capacity to do that, and it's often the things that are the most difficult for us. In my case, it was the culture shock and the question of identity that actually led me to do the workshops that I then started doing at Microsoft and then Esalen and whatever. Yeah. So yes, thanks to my international family. Great question, Jake. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And so there's a way that you kind of turned your suffering into, this whole moving force that you are now. Um, and I remember when you were speaking then, I was reminded of something a teacher said once. And it was in a workshop somewhere around the world. I can't remember where it was, but they said that an English person is their biggest fear is to be seen. And an American person, which is maybe more like, like the Russians, is like they have a fear to not be seen. I wonder if like there's kind of like this, if that resonates, or if there was some like conflictual thing of like, yeah, like the English person is like in their shell, like scared to come out, and the rest is just full out there and kind of maybe scared to go in. I don't know if we can make that jump from the US to Ukraine, but it's
Oh, absolutely. I think it's really nice. I'm thinking in my mind, what do they say about the Australians then? But maybe we'll get back to that later. But I mean, I went to English schools, British schools, and then I went out for a year. I got a scholarship to go to the States when I was 16 and spent a year in New York. And in England, it's sort of like hold yourself back, don't push yourself forward, be modest. You always got to use understatement. Maybe it's a little similar in Australia. And then I went to America, and it's like show people who you are. It's the kind of the pioneer mentality, and it's important to be loud. So yeah, and I find that with my teams. I've worked a lot in Scandinavia with a Danish company, and they have real problems when they're working with American colleagues because these will be women with PhDs who've a huge experience in the pharmaceutical industry, but they will never say that out loud. And the Americans just don't take them seriously. So I really push them. You've got to say who you are. And we are not victims of our cultural background. We can choose which of the parts do I want to continue having, and how do I want to modify my style in order to maybe come across in a more, appropriate way in the culture that I'm working in without losing ourselves. And I think that's really important that we also recognize what the strengths that I got from our background. But we are more than our background culture, but we need to be aware of that in order to grow beyond that. But yeah, it's interesting about the British and the Americans there. And I mean, there's all sorts of things going on in Europe here around culture at the moment. With Europe dissolving, and it's an important question, I would say. Culture.
Yeah, and I think you kind of touch on something because it's subtle but really needed. Is like, I guess, like one thing that I really learned from you, I remember, is like listening, patience, like really seeking to understand and to kind of be with other people in the way that they sort of need to be, you know, be with in some way. And so a certain level of like being really receptive and listening in the conversation to kind of see where the other person is. But like you said, that there's a balance there between not losing oneself. Um, and I kind of see, yeah, there's maybe this always constant tension there, especially for someone like a Scandinavian person. It's like, that's maybe more inwards and internal and quiet. Like, how does one remain being themselves when they, if that kind of makes some sense, this kind of balance between these two things.
Absolutely, and I think it's about it's situational as well. So, we talk about it's important to frame who you are in the intercultural world. So, like to put a frame. So like I might start a seminar saying, "Hi, I'm from the north of England. I use a lot of irony and stupid British humor." So I'm like framing. So like some people who are from more serious cultures might think this woman doesn't take herself seriously. But if I've already framed this is my style, or when I'm doing a leadership seminar, I'll say, I really like immediate feedback, so please feel free to give me that. I'm from a low power distance culture. So framing is usually important. I think often people just want to fit in and adapt when they go to another culture. And there are times when that's really important too. So I use, so framing is one aspect. The next one is adaptation. And I have this image of like a chameleon, right? I don't know if you have chameleons in Australia. You probably do because you've got everything in Australia, right?
Yeah, I don't know if we do. I mean, we're familiar with them, and these little transforming beings, but yeah, I'm not quite sure if we have them or not. Don't in Melbourne, I don't think so, but maybe somewhere up north where it's a bit more tropical.
Okay, well, those transforming beings, I like your choice of words there. So I think sometimes when we're in the intercultural setting, we have to be like a chameleon or a transforming being. That, if I go up to Finland, for example, where they are exactly as you said, very introverted, I will turn my volume down a little bit, my internal volume and my brightness and my Russian grandmotherness, because it kind of scares them. Yeah. Now, when I was working for the UN, I spent a lot of time in Beirut, which was wonderful because there people love poetry. Like in the middle of a leadership seminar, I can actually read poetry, and they loved it. And I could be dramatic and wave my arms about. So that's adaptation. It's being the chameleon. But I think always, and especially I think at the beginning of relationships or at the beginning of teamwork, we need to adapt. But at some stage, it's hugely important, first of all, to be very aware ourselves of where we're coming from, how free we're feeling with that adaptation, how much can I adapt without, as you said, losing myself, right? And when do we need to then really frame our cultures so that we are there with all our colors? I always say that an international team is like a mosaic of beautiful colored stones. And a lot of people think an international team has got to be like some kind of porridge, grey porridge that you stir together and everyone's the same, which is terribly boring, right? Like polyfiller, we call it in England, that you slap on the walls. Whereas a mosaic takes time. You've got to think, where does the red stone, we need the green stone next to the red stone, how can these work together? So I think you need a lot more pre-work for international teams to work well. But when you do that, they can be so much more creative and create such a larger picture than when people just try to fit in and become the same kind of color porridge. Does that make sense, Jake?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally, and I think that's beautiful, just, I guess, that visual of the mosaic of all the different patterns and how they all fit in, and also kind of, thinking about a mosaic, it's not a perfect, it's not made on the computer where you get all these straight lines, like, sometimes you got little crooked edges and sort of fitting in these creative ways, which I think is wonderful, and I guess, like, you having done this for so long, I sort of like, where do you sort of see this now? Like, where do you see, I guess, like the current sort of mosaic of, I guess we're like entering in a world of like globalization is, more than it's ever been before. And things are speeding up quick. And we have things like social media and, we can do this. Like, I mean, we can have a conversation right now and you're on the other side of the world. Like, it's an amazing.
It is. And there's a lot of resistance to it in Europe, virtual work. I had the same thing. I mean, like for a year, we've basically been in lockdown here. And first of all, at the university, they said, will you do your seminars online? I'm like, no. And then I thought about it. I thought, well, maybe yes. So like I familiarized myself with Zoom. I've started now doing team building via Zoom and as well as my normal seminars. And I'm amazed just how much you can achieve. So already this week, I think I mentioned it just as we started the call. I was on a call. I had a lady in South Africa, someone in Australia, someone in Spain. The rest were from Germany. We were a group of 8. They hardly knew each other. And we had 2 sessions, 4 hours last week and this week. And it was incredible how much the people bonded, although they hadn't actually met face to face. And what I think the key is, and maybe this taps into some of the work you're doing, it's about telling our stories. It's about the power of storytelling. So what I do, I have certain techniques where I encourage people to, like you asked me to tell a story about my background. I'll get them to draw a tree, for example, and they talk about where are my roots, where am I branching out to, what are my fears, what are my hopes, who influenced me. And as soon as people start telling each other stories and they share their vulnerability, this creates really, really deep bonds. So I'm being more and more daring in my work, because I've often worked in corporate settings or even in the UN where, you've got to be a bit kind of linear, right? And, you've got lots of stuff in the agenda you've got to teach them. But I'm going more into color and storytelling. And I just think it's so important to connect people right now because people are feeling lonely in Europe, isolated. You're in a better position right now in Australia as far as the pandemic is concerned. But I feel that it is possible, and virtuality helps us to connect, and we need more time for the human factor. So I'm doing less of the agenda and tools and da-da and Excel tables. I'm doing more of the storytelling, of allowing people moments of emotion, of sharing. It's not a psychological striptease. I always say share as much or as little as you want. But when we share something of our soul, of our heart, of what we're sad about, maybe, what we're hoping for, then there's a heart connection. And I'm just daring. I mean, I can afford to be daring now because I'm not at the beginning of my career. I mean, back then when I worked in a very, very kind of linear, sterile, black and white world of Siemens back here in Germany, and I wore a black suit and, high heels and stuff. I can afford to be more colourful now, because I don't like to say I'm moving towards the end of my career. That sounds terrible, but I don't have to go out there and prove myself. So for me, it's still incredibly rewarding when I get a group of people, young people, and I feel I can inspire them a little bit because they're all younger than me now. or I can just connect them, creating communities. And I have many, many weaknesses, but I think that's one thing that I love doing. One thing that I can do is creating a community, even out of people who aren't actually meeting face to face, they can't have a beer together. They're at different corners of the world, and how wonderful is that? And we can do it without, the quality's good as well. It's wonderful. I mean, it's really almost like we are now. I can see your eyes, and I can see when you find something touching, when it touches into the work you're doing. We can sense that, although we're thousands, I don't know how many thousands of kilometers apart, but it doesn't feel like that right now, right?
Yeah, yeah, quite a few. And, I kind of feel like you're touching on a subject that we spoke about earlier before the podcast, of this power of group. You mentioned that this sort of power of group is, I guess, really central to your work in the way that you're describing it. And, even when we're, in a physical group, in the flesh and bone, it's one thing, but there still seems to be this thing online that we can kind of capture. But I guess just like groups in general, like what do you find is powerful about that? Like, what is it about the group? What is it about?
I don't know if I just notice when you say, I get energized when I just hear the word group, right? So there's a big
Yeah, I can see
charge in
your
it. But
face kind of light up.
just
You're like, "Ah!"
something popped into my mind. It's a bit inane, but I thought maybe it's because I'm an only child. I'm an only child, so when I'm in a group, I feel like I've got a big
I'm
family.
also an only child.
Oh, I
It's
didn't
good to
know
know. Yeah, yeah.
that. That's maybe why you work with groups. Maybe we've discovered the secret. But that feeling of family or community or tribe, I think that's also a term you use in your world, Open. But how can you get that feeling of belonging, right? So it goes also back to the cultural thing. And, we don't always belong in our background families, or maybe we don't even feel we belong in our countries. But when we can find a group that we can feel we belong to, even if it's just for a weekend, right? Or it's an ongoing group or whatever, that's so important. And I think we underestimate the human need to feel that they belong. And when we can create environments, or a group setting where people feel that they belong, and they feel that they're included and that they're allowed to be themselves. I remember this thing from Esalen. They always say, bring your whole self to work. People who used to work in the garden at Esalen, they say, we want to bring your whole self to work. And I just always love that. So when people feel they can bring their whole self to the group, rather than thinking, I have to behave to fit into this group, and they feel safe, then the sky is the limit. Because if we feel safe to, express ourselves in respectful ways, we can so much learn to move with each other. And as you said, the jagged edges, and find creative ways how we fit together and how we can create so much more than just the separate parts. And I really don't think we were born to be isolated beings. And, I think when I think back to the happiest times of my life, it's situations like Essendon, where we had a group, we were together for a month, 5 weeks, I think. It was 5 weeks, longer than a month. And every day you see each other, you're eating together, and in a wonderful environment, of course, but to create that feeling of belonging. And I think the group, there's so much power, and it can be used negatively, of course. I think you've got to be really careful, because there's this group think where, you know, because people want to belong, they'll just say, yeah, 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 we'll do that, and this can lead to all sorts of horrible things like fascism, and. So I think it's really hugely important when we create a group to make sure that people don't feel they have to just fit in, that they have to go along with the rest of the group, that they're allowed to have their own thoughts, that they're welcome who they are. And if we do that, I think the potential is enormous. And I've seen that with many of the teams that I've worked with. When they have that sense of belonging, the creative solutions they come up with, especially because they're from different backgrounds, is just phenomenal, you know? And then I look at countries that are already very diverse, like America or Australia. I mean, you're all kind of from somewhere. You've all immigrated from, well, not all of you, the indigenous people, not, but most, yeah? And they've all got different backgrounds. I think that's why maybe they're very successful. Whereas I see in Europe, people always stay in the same place, and they don't mix with different people from different groups, and it's not quite as creative, maybe. I think Europe's on the downward slide. But that's group, yeah, group, and it's energy. I mean, sorry if I'm talking too much. Just one last thing. I just,
No,
when I
we're here to have a
travel,
conversation. You can you
yeah,
can
when I
talk.
used to travel all the
Yeah, yeah.
time, I'd sometimes be really exhausted. Like I'd arrive in Bangkok to do a session, the UN and I'd have jet lag and I think, oh my God, I wouldn't sleep well. How am I going to do it? And I'd walk into the room, and as soon as I connected with the people, I would get so much energy. And that is potentiated, So if you've got 27 managers from all over the world, that energy carries you. And I think if people are on your wavelength and into that, it just gives you so much energy. Or maybe, yeah, groups are wonderful things. I'm feeling homesick for groups right now, Jake.
Yeah, I know. In a pandemic, it's an interesting thing to talk about, the power of groups when a lot of the world is sitting at home in their own living rooms with very little contact. Um, yeah, and I kind of wonder, this kind of work is growing and growing. I guess what I do and what you do is sort of vastly different worlds, but still kind of have the same sort of ontological perspective in some way of just like the center of what we're doing. Um, and I guess in a growing world of like, people feeling like they don't belong to the earth and they don't belong to cultures. And, with a lot of the issues that we have now, it seems like it's an important and crucial thing to be doing to be able to sit in a space that we can hear each other and be with each other and listen and connect in ways seems very needed. And I'd love to sort of bring the conversation to the UN. Because also in like a bit of your writings, it seemed from what I could gather, and correct me if this is wrong, um, that you were working in the UN and you kind of created your own role somehow. Like, was that, did I kind of read that correctly? That you were sort of doing maybe something in leadership and you sort of found your own niche in intercultural communication?
Yeah, that's tragic. I'm amazed how well you know me, Jake. I mean, like, but I mean, when you say you created your own role, I would say that applies to my whole life and my whole work. I moved to a country not knowing anyone. I was pregnant with my first child. My husband was a taxi driver, worked 5 nights a week. We had very little money. I didn't speak the language. So, it took me a while and it wasn't easy, but then I always created my own role. I mean, this intercultural awareness, this is the mid 90s we're talking about. I think my first workshop was 95. And there was one other lady I know in Munich who did something a little similar, but it didn't exist. So my whole life is about being creating a niche or a role, and specifically within the UN. The reason I got into the UN, I was asked. Someone recommended me. I'd done something called personal leadership in Crestone in the States with some wonderful people who'd created something called personal leadership. And one of the founders of Personal Leadership also worked on the leadership program at the UN, and she recommended me. So they asked me to join it. Basically, it's a leadership management development program. And they already had the set program, the design was written. Usually, I always create my own designs. And in this case, the design was created. There's a lot of management development models, great models. But of course, because my passion is around culture, and I think they were interested in that because they'd had a lot of feedback from the UN. Yeah, it's great, but it's very American. Most of these, I think all of the management models were American, and we were teaching this stuff to people. We went to Dakar in Senegal, we were in Bangkok, we were in Beirut, and the models were great, but I don't think you can take like one size fits all. Yeah. So because I'd done so much intercultural work, I kind of just allowed myself a little bit more space, and they were open to that, of course, because they realized they needed that, because a lot of the design just came from America. So I kind of created a space within the leadership program where we looked at culture and we looked at some of the models we were using, and we thought about how does our background culture allow this? How comfortable would we feel with using these models, let's say in Thailand, if we have a very high power distance? Will it work? How can it work? And I'll never forget, and I just want to share this briefly. I worked for a long time with a lovely man from India who was a department head in Bangkok. And the first time I saw him, he had the traditional Indian dress. And I complimented him. I said, "This looks wonderful, Atul." And he said, "Yes, Nina, but it's frowned upon in the UN. When I actually wear this to, high powered meetings, people don't like it." And I was appalled. And I think what we also have to remember is that within organizations, there's often a dominant culture, right? And when there's a dominant culture, people tend, it's back to the theme we were talking about before, people tend to want to fit into that, right? This is how I'm supposed to be. So I'm supposed to wear a suit. It's the white American male, basically. Yeah. So yeah, I was allowed to have some space there. I wouldn't say we didn't turn it into an intercultural seminar. It was still a management development seminar, but we had two modules and we put like an extra day in for culture in both of the modules, which was wonderful. I didn't solve all the problems at the UN. I mean, there's so many issues there, and I think one of the main issues that sometimes people are too politically correct at the UN. They're afraid of saying what's different and what's weird for them. They don't have the language to talk about difference. So they pretend there is no cultural difference. And I just don't believe that. You know, I saw there were a lot of issues because of culture. And I think we really need to find a language for dealing with that. You know? And a safe environment where people feel safe enough to discuss that.
Yeah. Yeah, an environment that's safe enough yet dangerous enough that we can kind of push the edges and talk about things that are uncomfortable. And I think in the UN it would seem like an important place is, I guess, this like, yeah, this balance between being politically correct when we need to, but also to be able to have the conversations that are tough to have. And I'm wondering for you, like, what the kind of maybe some clues, towards, I guess, a really culturally aware and, an organization, say like the UN, but I guess like any organization around the world, like, how do we sort of move towards that?
Mm. I think we have to start with ourselves, Jake. You know, I think there's a lot of inner work that we all need to do. And when I talk to someone like you, it gives me a lot of hope because I think you're the next generation. And maybe people in my generation haven't done enough work, or, you know, I think we have to start with ourselves. I always say that when I do any kind of intercultural work, you know, often people come to my seminars saying, well, I want to learn about the Japanese, or the Arab culture, they're so different. And I say, no, we start with ourselves. But they say, but I'm normal. You know, everybody thinks they're normal. It's the other culture that's weird. So I say 50% of it is self-reflection. So I think, it's like in anything, whether it's working at the UN or being in a relationship, a happy relationship, we have to say, how can I make myself as complete as possible with everything that I've experienced in my life and be committed to a lifetime of eternal learning and growing and keeping my heart open. How can I keep my heart open? How can I we talk about being open minded. I think we have to practice being open minded and open hearted. And that starts with ourselves. And I do something, I've even introduced meditation practices at the UN and in my groups, even in corporate groups. And I find there's a practice called metta meditation, loving kindness. I think we're far too critical with ourselves. If we're critical with ourselves, we're then critical with other. Um, and to develop that warm heart where we're kind to ourselves will allow us to be kind to others. It maybe sounds a little simplistic, but that's the very spontaneous answer that I can come up with. So to introduce different practices, why not do an open floor session at the UN, for example? Why not do a meditation at the UN? And I think in my generation, these things were very separate. I used to do these very straight seminars at Siemens, and then I'd go to Esalen and be a hippie, and do my yoga and my dance, and it was two different things. So the question is, how can we integrate these worlds that for many years in my generation were very, very separate? That's what we need to do. How can people enjoy life more? How can they keep their hearts open, their minds open? How can they just be joyful with each other and connect with each other? Whether that's through exploring culture or dancing together or telling their stories or, drawing a picture together. This is what people need to do. And we need each other. We really, really need each other. We can exist in isolation. Yeah. But it's not the ideal, right? And we do have the virtual means now. And I think we need for as long as we can't travel freely, we have to be creative. I'd be very curious to see how you do that in the dance world, that people move together online. It's kind of easier when you're sitting down, but I'm sure there are ways of doing this. But I just like a message for anyone who's listening. Just, I think that we all should never underestimate our circle of influence and our responsibility to say, how can I be more open hearted? How can I be more open minded? How can I just be more easeful and accepting of myself? And the rest will flow from there. And then to go out and have fun. And yeah, there's maybe one thing that was bursting out of me to say is that to recognize what a wonderful gift it is simply to be alive. Sometimes it feels really shitty. I have bad days too, and you think, oh God, this is just too tough. But it's a huge, huge gift. And as you know, Jake, I lost my son 5 years ago, my eldest son, Max. He was 28 when he died of a skiing accident. And the reason I'm bringing him in now is because I just want to remind everyone that, life is not forever. We need to make the most of it right now, right here, and to do whatever we can to be more at ease with ourselves and to make the world a better place. We always think one day, when I'm grown up, or when I'm calm, I'm going to do this. But we have to start right here, right now. And
Yeah,
so
that's
thank you for
beautiful.
letting me share that. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, you model that so well. I mean, it kinda takes me back to our time together, 6 years ago, and, I think that the course was leading from the heart. And I think
That's
that,
true. I'd forgotten that was the title.
yeah, you do that in a really, powerful way. So, yeah, thank you for
Thank
sharing that
you.
because it is, a good reminder, that anything can happen at any time. And, we have this one life. And I kind of love to come back to what you said about like responsibility. It's not like we have this responsibility to show up for ourselves. We have a responsibility to do our own work. We have a responsibility to be with others in a really respectful and loving and generous way. And I just think that's a lovely sentiment of a way to move in the world. Because I think these ideas of intercultural, awareness is just going to grow and grow and grow. Well, we need these awarenesses more because, our world is becoming so much more globalized. So I think we need these tools of, coming together.
Absolutely. And I think to accept and love ourselves, you know? It sounds so easy and it's so damn hard, you know, however we are, whoever we are. And of course, sadly, some cultures are taught that they're better than others, or we all have chips on our shoulders because of one experience or another. And to move beyond that and to really focus on strengths rather than weaknesses. I think a lot of our Western culture anyway has been about, how can I improve my weaknesses? Or we're taught at school, we look at the red marks that weren't good, but to really to say, okay, what am I good at? Don't focus on what you're not good at. Look at what you're good at and say, how can I get more of that? And to acknowledge your strengths. We take them just for granted. We think, that's not important, Other people have much better strengths than me. But to really, celebrate your strengths. I'm looking at you and thinking, you're fantastic. You've done a great job. And you're probably a bit aware of that, but not as aware of it as you should be, Jake. None of us are. And I'm saying this, and I'm the worst offender.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's sometimes hard to direct that to the self, isn't it? I mean, it's and I guess it's there's something of, I guess, like a beautiful sentiment in like finding ourselves in the presence of others. I kind of feel like it's often hard to know. Like I was thinking about this before this interview in terms of the travel that I've done. And I feel like I mean, to speak about it culturally, only really knew the culture that I grew up in until I went to different places and then saw a different culture. It's like, oh my God, I actually didn't know that about myself. And I think it's like the same in what we're saying here. It's like we need to go and plunge into ways where people look at us in certain ways and think like, oh yeah, you're really amazing for this thing, which for us, when we're self-deprecating all the time and thinking how shit we are and we're nervous and anxious and, the whole thing, it's like the gift of, I guess, a word or a compliment or a thing can go a long way because like you said, it is hard to direct that stuff to the self. Often because we're so blind to it, not even because we don't want to acknowledge ourselves, but it's hard to recognize.
It's invisible. I always, when I do my cultural seminars, I say that our own culture is completely invisible to us. We notice when someone's different. So let's say, I don't know, we go to Japan and they smile a lot or don't speak up or whatever. We notice that, oh, that's different. And I always say use there's something called mirror reflected awareness. I think it was actually a Japanese interculturalist. And he said, turn the mirror around. So when you notice difference, oh, that's weird, that's strange. For example, people in Germany say, oh God, the Americans are so patriotic. They've got like the American flag everywhere. They're nationalistic. And I say, no, no, turn the mirror around. If this is the mirror, right? So you turn the mirror around, it says, this is because in Germany we're told not to be patriotic because of the Second World War. So whenever we see something that's different or uncomfortable, that's a great opportunity to turn the mirror around and say, okay, what does this say about my own culture? So that we can make our own culture more visible. And we need to make our own culture more visible to ourselves. And as you said, the perfect thing is traveling because that's where we notice that we are Australian or British or whatever. And then we also need to frame our culture that we make our culture visible to others. So people say, okay, Nina isn't just like a freaky thing because she waves her arms around. She's like an emotional person. That's part of her background culture. So making our culture visible to ourselves and to others, I think, is hugely important. And realizing that most of the time, our strengths, are invisible to ourselves because we've been so conditioned to focus on what we're not good at, right? What's not good enough.
Yeah, and I'm curious to know what you think. I mean, I guess there's a big movement, and I think a necessary movement at the moment around, what it means to be local. I think we're seeing a lot of problems coming from um yeah, I guess globalization and people sort of spreading out and not eating local food and being with the people that are their neighbors. It's like we all live in these little isolated homes. And I guess there's a big movement, I mean, I can say for Australia, of like becoming more local. What does it mean to be with the community that we're in? And I guess like in some way kind of not in some ways worrying about what the rest of the world is doing. We all have our own little cultures, and that's great. But I guess in this I guess world that's just becoming, we're losing culture in a lot of ways because we're just becoming westernized, and things are sort of blending together more. I guess I'm just curious to know what you sort of think about that. I guess like preserving culture but then living in a culture that is really starting to blend together, and I guess where you kind of sit with that and how you kind of think about what it means to be local but then what it means to be of the world. um,
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question and it's about assimilation also, how much should like minority cultures be assimilated? And I think, of course, we lose something when culture is assimilated. I mean, I'll give you an example from my own first international team, right? My father's family were Jewish, which has a very strong culture, and traditionally they always, they didn't marry out of the religion, so they kept the culture and the religion going. In my grandmother's case, all her three sons married out of the religion. So I'm half Jewish. My son is quarter Jewish. And so I still do like Friday evening rituals sometimes where I do the meal. I don't really know the prayers. I'm losing it. My son, okay, he knows how to make chicken soup, but it kind of gets more and more diluted. And I think in a way, assimilation is a shame because we lose those individual flavors, whether it's the food or the way of thinking or the way of dressing. I mean, I did a workshop this week with a guy from Brisbane who's actually from Turkestan, and he showed us this huge, big, shaggy hat that they wear in Turkestan. I mean, when you meet him, he seems like the Australian, but actually he's an immigrant, and he's covered it up very well. But when you see him, this hat, it's like amazing, and I don't want people to lose their amazing hats. I think that we need to find a way, but you see, people need to feel safe to show the culture. Many people have been punished over the years when they were obviously different. I remember my own grandmother saying to me, never tell anyone that you're half Jewish, Nina. And I thought, why? Because in England it wasn't a problem. But there are places in the world where I don't tell people that. Um, so it's a hard one. This local is maybe a bit different from what I was talking about. The local, I mean, what the huge example for me is with my own country, the UK at the moment, which has left Europe, which I think is an example of what you're saying. We're an island, we just want to be British, we're not European, and going back, withdrawing from being part of a greater whole. I personally find that rather sad. Um, I think it's about balance, Jake. I think we need to be very comfortable in our own national identities. So we need to be proud of who we are, but that shouldn't slip into nationalism, where people say, I'm better than you, basically. But I would, in an ideal world, which your generation is going to create, right? I want to see that, people are allowed to be their minority cultures. People still travel and get inspired by each other, and that we take the best of different cultures and at the same time being firmly rooted in who we are. I think Mahatma Gandhi said it beautifully. He said, let my house be open, let the door be open, let all the windows be open, let all the cultures blow in, but let no culture blow me off my feet. That was Mahatma Gandhi. So, this idea of being very welcoming and open to the influences, but to allow your house to remain standing, because you're firmly rooted in a sense of who you are and where you come from. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I guess there's like a sort of a theme that I'm sort of picking up on is also this there's always this sort of reciprocity, between like holding truth, of who we are and also extending out. This is like constant kind of openness um and a preserving, who we are and where we come from, and that's really important. And I know for a lot of people, where we've come from is not necessarily a positive thing anymore. So then we kind of enter in all of these challenges where it's like, you come from a culture that's, you know, hard done by, and for whatever reason we don't resonate with it.
Absolutely. And I mean, some cultures are seen more positively than others. I mean, to give you an example, when I moved here to Germany, I'd like to tell people quite quickly I'm from England, and they like England here. So they're like, they're the good kind of foreigners and the bad kind of foreigners, right? I mean, 80 years ago, if I'd have said I'm Jewish in Germany, it would have been as good, So it's just the luck of history, and when we're born at a certain time, if you come from the right kind of cultural or not, which seems so unfair and arbitrary. Yeah, and how can we move away from that? And I think that idea of everybody bringing their whole self to the party or bringing their whole self to work, everybody needs to feel valued. How can we make everybody feel valued? And this is a lot of work, because systematically over many generations, some cultures have not felt as valued as others. So it's great. There's a lot of work to be done. And I think now more than ever, we need to do it. I grew up, Jake, in the 70s where there was a lot of liberalism. It was like, when I was a little girl, the Beatles were playing on the radio and people started taking drugs and things and wearing hippie clothes and everything was free. Great decade, the 60s. I was born in 62, right? So by 68, like mum was taking funny pills and doing the washing and the Beatles were on. And like business was, economically there was a lot going on. Yeah. And then I was in the 70s and I could be really free. And, I remember visiting Russia in 76 when it was still communism, and I had like a hippie sheepskin coat on and I felt so free because I was from the West. Well, economically, things aren't as good now. People can afford to be generous when economically they've got enough to eat, when they're not scared of losing their jobs. But there are many people now, I think, who are more scared. So they're not going to be as open, right? They're not going to be as welcoming of foreigners. So how can we influence that we keep being welcoming, to whatever cultures, as Mahatma Gandhi said? We have to find ways, whether that's, with the open floor or group things, or we just have to keep working on it harder than ever, I would say. And, sometimes I think I was just very privileged to be born in this time. We haven't had a war, always had enough to eat. Okay, we've got a pandemic. That's the first time we've really kind of suffered in some way. And I just feel very, very privileged. And things aren't as easy as they were. So we need the good even more, right? We have to work harder. And it's a huge responsibility for your generation, but a very, very exciting challenge. And I think one last thing I want to say, Jake, is if we have a sense of purpose, when things get really tough, and you're really exhausted. And when we are faced with adversity, as we all are at some stage in our life, if we can keep that sense of core purpose, why am I doing this? You know, and connect to the larger out of oneself, that we're not just lost in our own stories of suffering, and we can connect to doing something greater that can keep us going, in the most adverse of situations. So this idea of why am I doing this? You know, what do I want to do with this? Why? What? Creating some good connection, whatever it is. So sense of purpose, sense of belonging, and the safety, creating a safe environment. But like you said very wisely, it shouldn't just be safe, it should be creatively challenging. That people move into the stretch zone, they don't go into the pain zone, but they don't stay in the comfort zone.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. I feel like, that's probably a beautiful note to end on. We've got a nice sort of little step-by-step guide and um
One last thing I want to say, we need to brainstorm when our joint workshop is.
we will do that. We will do that. I feel we've got many threads that could come together and wisdom from many different legs of the world. Um and yeah, I guess just from what you last said, this idea of honoring difference. How can we honor difference, appreciate difference, and like you said earlier, finding new ways to speak about these things and finding new language to, I guess, understand that we all come from the same earth. We all come from a very similar shaped womb. We all go to the same place afterwards, wherever that is, and it probably doesn't really matter where that is. Um, but yeah, how can we bring that together?
Absolutely. And that you creating a wonderful sense of perspective, get it all into perspective. Like, let's not take ourselves too seriously. Yes, we can change the world, but let's not take ourselves too seriously and have some fun along the way, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Can have a bit of a laugh.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for being here, Nina. So appreciated chatting to you and, hearing what you have to say about, all the work that you do. It's been inspiring and
And you've inspired me too, Jake. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And all the best for anyone who's listening to this. And focus on your resources and your strengths and go out and make a difference. I'm counting on you.